One of the biggest debates in the early church was whether a married priest, a priest who had been ordained, can continue to still have marital relations with his wife and have children. And there are different opinions about whether this was a universal custom and even apostolic tradition to forbid it.
One of our great desert fathers, Abba Paphnutius, stood up and said what would become the standard line for the Orthodox to this day. To mandate such as a law is to set yourself forward as more holy than the apostles. And Abba Paphnutius won the day.
The married priesthood is that always stayed in the East, and in the West, that's a different question.
A Catholic apologist, Ben Bollinger, recently wrote an article for Catholic Answers that the universal teaching, the universal custom, and apostolic tradition, what the apostles gave was that ordained clergy are not to have relations with their wives if they are married. And so I want to dive into the history of this topic. It's also relevant, too, because we have a recent canonized saint, and that is Saint Olga of Alaska, and she was a Matushka. She was a priest's wife, and she had 13 children. Some of them died early on. But the question is, would someone like St. Paul, would he commend St. Olga that they had children after her husband's ordination? Would he tolerate it, or would he forbid it and think that it was against apostolic teaching and practice? Now, looking at all of the present communions that have a history back to the ancient church, for example, Latins, Roman Catholics, generally would answer this question, no, you cannot continue having relations with your wives. Now, they do tolerate it today with deacons or Eastern Catholic clergy, but traditionally the classic standpoint from the Latin perspective was that no, the apostles did not hand that on. The Greeks, the Orthodox Church, answered it differently. They believed it was acceptable to do this. The Assyrians, the Church of the East, and the Orientals, Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, also answer the question, yes, they can. And so you do see a large swath saying yes to this question, while the Latins generally, historically, said no. We also have to keep in mind that the majority of the church in the first millennium was significantly more Eastern. The biggest sees, the most bishops, the most people were coming from the seas. And so the majority standpoint was that this could happen. But yet there was this great value. And I want to make this important point that Ben and I and Catholics and Orthodox are very much on the same page that the monastic life, the life of celibacy for the kingdom of God, the angelic life, it's a beautiful thing. And so there is a robust understanding of monastic life in the Orthodox Church. And it's an eschatological sign of what is to come. Real quick, the four big points that Ben makes is, number one, church teaching was unanimous in their commentary on Scripture for clerical continence. So either clerical celibacy, that would be a single priest who doesn't have a wife, or if you do have a wife, you're practicing continence. That means no sexual marital relations after your ordination, which would include in the Latin West deacons, and in the early cases, that would be subdeacons. Number two, the story of St. Paphnutius, who was a monk from Egypt and also a confessor who was tortured by Roman persecutions. He believes that story of him defending the right for priests to have relations with their spouses at Nicaea I was fabricated.
As early as the First Ecumenical Council, delegates attempted to get the council to pass a law that all priests, even if they were married when they became priests, must cease from having sexual relations, conjugal union, with their wives if they're going to serve. The minutes of the council say that one of our great desert fathers, Abba Paphnutius, stood up and said what would become the standard line for the Orthodox to this day. To mandate such as a law is to set yourself forward as more holy than the apostles. You're holier than the apostles. Who are you to do that? This was the answer. And Abba Paphnutius won the day. And that would remain a point of contention between the East and the West.
Number three, the Council of Trullo, which is viewed ecumenically by the Orthodox Church, was innovating away from the apostolic tradition and universal discipline of clerical continence ratified by the Council of Carthage in Nicaea I. So his view is that Trullo was completely innovating the idea that relations could continue after ordination. Number four, as we spoke earlier, the Church of the East, Oriental churches, and, of course, the Holy Orthodox Church, the Church, all introduced later the novelty of allowing married priests to have children with their wives. And he kind of hints at this in the article, but in my dialogues with him in the past online, he seems to hint that this is really influenced by heretical thinking. At the moment that you break off the Roman Catholic Church, then you're going to immediately start allowing like married priests. If I've misrepresented Ben, I hope he lets me know, but I'm trying to do my best to represent his views. And he provides a strand of evidence, and I think the evidence is actually good. I mean, it's good for Orthodox to see that this debate didn't just start after the schism. This was a very hefty debate in the early church, whether this be a regional council doing something or a universal council. Was this a certain bishop or a collection of bishops in a synod, particularly Carthage, forbidding relations after ordination, or is this the universal declaration of the church? Now, I want to begin with scripture and then move to the fathers and then to conciliar decisions. Of course, we get to St. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He's very clear that if you're married, you should only fast for a certain season. He writes, "Because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, marital intimacy, open to life, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a set time, like a fasting season, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were like myself, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind." Now, some might respond and say, oh, he's just talking to lay people here. He's not talking to the presbyters. But why would that be the case without clarification? We know that St. Paul appoints presbyters in every city. And so Corinth has presbyters. He's also addressing them throughout the letter. He asks them, why haven't they done anything disciplinary with the man who was having relations with his stepmom? Why haven't you done something about that? I mean, sure, lay people could have done something, but in that scenario, he's primarily addressing the presbyters, those who have authority. They're also divided, some following Paul, some following Apollos, some following Peter. And so this letter seems to be addressed not to just the laity, but the presbyters who are running the church as well. So St. Paul here is giving sort of a general picture, and it doesn't seem to be addressed just to lay people, but also to the married presbyters or priests as well. And I think Clement of Alexandria, when he comments on this text, also says this. Now, we also have a text later on in 1 Corinthians 9:5. Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife, as do other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Now, some translate wife as just sort of like a woman who is taking care of business and, maybe cooking needs, financing needs. We know that Christ, our Lord, who was celibate, was accompanied by women who funded his ministry, who helped with all sorts of, they were basically patrons doing all sorts of things for the ministry. And so it's possible that this could be what he was referring to. But it's also possible that the apostles were, some of them were accompanied by their wives. Now, this isn't like proof that they were having relations, but if you connect 1 Corinthians 9 with 1 Corinthians 7, it does seem like it could be a possibility. Now, when we get to Clement of Alexandria, when he's commenting on 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he writes, Paul entirely approves of the man who is a husband of one wife, whether he's a presbyter, hear that, presbyter or priest, deacon or layman, if he makes use of marriage blamelessly. How do we know he's also talking about procreation? Well, he talks about it in the context of his writings. He writes, begetting children and domestic life, for they preserve the harmony of the law and the gospel, and approve both the man who with thanks to God enters upon marriage with sobriety, and the man who in accordance with the Lord's will lives as a celibate. So, hey, if you're, when you want to be a monk, you want to be a single man and be celibate, all good. If you want to live in marriage with sobriety, also good. Again, he's talking about this in the context of not just lay people, but also presbyters. Even as each individual is caned, making his choice without blemish and in perfection. He continues, if anyone dares to call marriage fornication, he again falls into blasphemy. Because, of course, the Latin tradition and the Roman Catholics are not calling marriage blasphemy. They're calling it a very good thing, in that, a husband and wife having children is an amazing thing. We're talking specifically, though, does this apply to presbyters, ordained priests, not with that which in marriage is bestowed for the purpose of procreation. So again, he's already mentioned presbyters, and he's speaking of the purpose of procreation. That is why the apostle also says, I wish then that the younger women marry, bear children, look after their houses, and give the adversary no occasion for abuse, for some have already turned aside after Satan. Indeed, he entirely approves of the man who is a husband of one wife, whether he be a presbyter, deacon, or layman, if he conducts marriage blamelessly, for he shall be saved by childbearing. So procreation, childbearing is connected even to presbyters and deacons. It also makes a lot of sense of what St. Paul was saying a couple hundred years back in his letter to the Corinthians.
The Wise Phone 2, which I currently use as my phone. It's an amazing phone that helps you not doom scroll or be addicted to social media and other vices because it doesn't have a web browser, but it does function like a phone. You can call, you can text, you can take pictures, you can do videos. It even has apps like Uber and Lyft. You can order food, maps to get around town, all the things that you kind of need in this modern life, while at the same time being able to have a boundary between you and work or you and distractions. So you can be more present with your family, with your kids, with your spouse, whomever. This has been a very freeing experience for me to have the Wise Phone 2. Again, you can get $40 off through my discount code KING today.
And so it's important to note Clement of Alexandria, which is in Egypt. And I do think that there is like this Alexandrian Egyptian tradition that relations with your wife after ordination is okay. Now, Clement also will speak of Peter and Philip begetting children. Now, he doesn't say like when they did this. Was this before Peter was, an apostle? Was it before Philip was a deacon? Okay, you can debate that. We know that Philip gave us his daughters in marriage, and Paul does not hesitate in one of his epistles to greet his wife, whom he did not take about with him that he might not be inconvenienced in ministry. That's kind of a debated point, whether Paul had a wife who was still alive, whether he was a widow. I'm not really getting into that. But Clement is making a point that the apostles had wives. And then he connects that, of course, at other points, that presbyters and deacons could have relations with their wives. Number 2, and since we have mentioned the subject, it is not improper to subjoin another account, which is given by another author, which is worth reading. And he talks about how Peter saw his own wife led out to die and was martyred. The second point is not saying that Clement is clearly, explicitly saying that the apostles are having relations after their ministries. I think in many cases, maybe they weren't because they were traveling all throughout the world and knew they were going to be martyred for Christ. But the traditional sort of presbyter who's staying in the same city, running a church, it's kind of a different situation than the apostles who have this kind of mission throughout the whole world, right? And Clement seems to be saying that presbyters and deacons can have relations with their wife even after ordination.
We have Clement, who writes against two heretical movements from the beginning of the 2nd century, around before 108. And he says very simply that, there are two heretical movements here. One is, the people who are licentious and very lax, and people who are of the hyper-ascetical movement. And the people who are of the hyper-ascetical movement wanted to say that, they wanted to raise the issue of celibacy to a doctrinal point, and to say that those clergy who were not celibate were heretics. And Clement wrote back and says that, look at Peter. Peter was married. Look at St. Philip. Philip had daughters. So that's from the apostolic era or the sub-apostolic era.
This is also what is defended by somebody else from Alexandria at the Council of Nicaea, 325. Now, this is a big deal because this is an ecumenical council. It's not a regional council like Carthage or a council in Spain. This is an ecumenical council. So regional councils might, mandate a command for their region, but once it reaches the universal level, that's actually what becomes the mandate. And so this is very important. St. Paphnutius of Alexandria states, at the Council of Nicaea, too heavy a yoke ought not to be laid upon the clergy, that marriage and married intercourse of themselves honorable and undefiled, that the church ought not to be injured by in extreme severity. For all who could not live in absolute continence, and by not prohibiting married intercourse, the virtue of the wife would be much more certainly preserved. The intercourse of a man with his lawful wife may also be a chaste intercourse. It would therefore be sufficient, according to the ancient tradition of the church, if those who had taken holy orders without being married were prohibited from marrying afterward. But those clergymen who had been married only once as laymen were not to be separated from their wives. If you become a priest and you're not married yet, you're not to be married. That's the Orthodox tradition. If you are already married, you become a priest, you can continue having relations with your wives. But if she passes away, then you are not to marry. Again, this is the Orthodox tradition. And this wonderful saint, a confessor, he was tortured by the pagan Romans for his faith, and he was loved and adored by the Christian Romans after Christianity was legalized. Now, Ben's going to say that this story is fabricated, or likely fabricated. I think that there's a good case to be made that it's not fabricated. There's also more situations. For example, St. Gregory the theologian's father was a married bishop, and it's believed that his son, St. Gregory, was born between his father's ordination as a priest and bishop. Now, in the Latin perspective, a deacon should not even be having relations with their wives. Okay? I'm just trying to show that in the Greek tradition, there's a little bit of a different understanding, which is important to note, particularly when we're trying to say whether something's a universal custom in apostolic tradition or not. Lastly, we should add that there is another story of a priest who was going to become a bishop, and this area is in the Egyptian region. In the year 410, when he's being considered to be ordained a bishop or patriarch of Alexandria, he stated that he would neither put away his God-given wife nor refuse her what is her due, but would have children by her. That is also clear historical evidence that clerical celibacy was not understood universally as a matter of obligation of apostolic tradition. This comes from an article called Celibate and Married Clergy in the Eastern Code. Of course, after Trullo, bishops were to come from monastic ranks. But early on, that was, of course, much more of a diverse landscape, what was going on there, and he did not want to give up relations with his wife. Now, it's important to note that some people would argue that Canon 3 of Nicaea I argued that it's forbidden for bishops, priests, or deacons to have a woman with them, like their wives. This is what the canon says. The Great Council has absolutely forbidden bishops, priests, and deacons, in other words, all members of the clergy, to have with them a sister companion, with the exception of a mother, sister, aunt, or lastly, those persons who are beyond suspicion. Now, it doesn't say wife here, so some people will be like, look, it's saying right here that they should not be with their wives, living in their homes. The problem is there's many married clergy, whether they're practicing continence or not, who are not kicking their wives out of their homes. And the Apostolic Constitution also say not to abandon their wives. This canon is pretty wise. You know, if you're a monk or a celibate single priest, it's probably not wise for you to be bringing women along with you unless it's your mom or your sister or a relative. If it's anybody else, there's going to be temptation or it's going to be suspicious. It's also the case that they may have assumed that wives were totally fine. This is an argument from silence. There's enough evidence that there were enough married clergy bringing their wives with them in their own ministries, and again, whether they're practicing continence or not, to show that this canon can't be addressing married clergy living with their wives, because the Apostolic Constitutions say not to put away your wives. So we have a whole tradition saying not to do that. So there's a whole ecclesiastical history, like church history, written by Socrates, and this was probably written around 439 to 443 AD, and it was finishing Eusebius's work. And this is what they have to say about what happened at the Council of Nicaea. As we have promised above to make some mention of Paphnutius and Spyridon, it is time to speak of them here. Paphnutius then was a bishop of one of the cities in Upper Thebes. He was a man so favored divinely that extraordinary miracles were done by him. In the time of the persecution, he had been deprived of one of his eyes. The emperor honored this man exceedingly and often sent for him to the palace and kissed the part where the eye had been torn out. So great devoutness characterized the Emperor Constantine. Let this single fact respecting Paphnutius suffice. I shall now explain another thing which came to pass in consequence of his advice, both for the good of the church and the honor of the clergy. To go on. It seemed fit to the bishops to introduce a new law into the church, that those who were in holy orders, I speak of bishops, presbyters, and deacons, should have no conjugal intercourse with the wives whom they have married while still laymen. Now, when discussion on this matter was impending, Paphnutius, having arisen in the midst of the assembly of bishops, earnestly entreated them not to impose so heavy a yoke on the ministers of religion, asserting that marriage itself is honorable, the bed undefiled, urging before God that they ought not to injure the church by too stringent restrictions. For all men cannot bear the practice of rigid continence, neither perhaps would the chastity of the wife of each be preserved. And he termed the intercourse of a man with his lawful wife chastity. It would be sufficient, he thought, that such as had previously entered on their secret calling should abjure matrimony, according to the ancient tradition of the church, but that none should be separated from her to whom, while yet unordained, he had been united. And these sentiments he expressed, although himself without experience of marriage. He was a celibate monk, tortured for his faith. And to speak plainly, without ever having known a woman, for from a boy he had been brought up in a monastery, and was specially renowned above all men for his chastity. The whole assembly of the clergy assented to the reasoning of Paphnutius, wherefore they silenced all further debate on this point, leaving it to the discretion of those who were husbands to exercise abstinence if they so wished in reference to their wives. This much concerning Paphnutius. So, if you're a presbyter, a deacon, before Trullo, then you are free to decide whether to have relations with your wives or not. Now, some decided not to, but it was more fitting. Beautiful thing. Some continued having kids after that. Beautiful thing. But what Ben and others have said is that this story is a fabrication, completely made up. And I'm not convinced of that. Of course, there's scholarship you can find on both sides, sort of like reconstructing the historical settings. Some question whether he was even at Nicaea because his signature isn't on the list. But there were other people that were at Nicaea that their signature doesn't show up on the list. And we have two records, and this is from a Latin, by the way. Now, he doesn't mention the story that was just mentioned about presbyters being able to continue having relations with their wives. The question is, why does he not include it? Maybe it's because the Latin tradition wasn't open to it. And so he doesn't include that story because he knew it would ruffle feathers. We don't really know why Rufinus doesn't include it. It's an argument from silence. But we do know that he does say that he was there. He talks about that he had his eyes gouged out, that he was condemned to the mines. There was in him such a grace of miracles that signs were worked through him no less than through the apostles of old. For he put demons to flight with mere word, cured the sick by prayer alone. He is also said to have returned sight to the blind and given back soundness of body to the crippled. Constantine regarded him with such veneration and love that many times he called him into the palace, embraced him, bestowed fervent kisses on the eye, which had been gouged out in the confession of his faith. So previous emperor, pagan, gouged out his eyes. Now the new emperor, a Christian, kisses his eyes as a sign of Christian brotherhood. Beautiful, beautiful story. So it seems with two accounts, we know that he was there and that he was a beloved monk and bishop, confessor of the faith. And so should we really doubt that he was there? I don't think so. You're going to be hypercritical about this story. You're going to have to be hypercritical about all sorts of stories that I know Ben and other Catholic apologists would not be hypercritical of. Now, there are some scholars who say, it's probably fabricated. There are other scholars who say, no, it really fits the historical context because Spain had actually passed a canon saying that deacons, presbyters, and bishops should not have relations with their wives. And so it probably was a relevant topic. Now, it's questionable whether that canon was even passed in Spain before Nicaea. Some say no, that it was a later canon. So there's a big debate about when these canons were passed. But let's say the canon was passed at a regional level and it's being debated at a universal level. The presence of this monk shut down the conversation, saying it should be left up to the husband, and this council is not going to mandate a universal mandate against it. As we conclude, it's obvious that the Orthodox tradition has maintained that it's okay and illicit for married deacons and presbyters to have relations with their wives after ordination, and that bishops will be pulled from monastic ranks or from those who are single. The Latin tradition did not go this direction, and even went so far as to mandate those Greeks with whom they are in communion with in foreign lands. Now, they did not apply this to those who were in their motherlands, but in the foreign lands, they would have to maintain celibacy. So if you're in Ukraine, you can be a married priest and continue to have relations. If you are in America, Canada, Australia, then for a good solid century, it was not permitted. Now, there were loopholes, as we'll talk about, but This was maintained even up throughout, up to where Pope Benedict was, up to 2012. He was very convinced, like Ben Bollinger and others, that it was an apostolic tradition that the priests should not have relations after ordination. And that even in 2012, there was even a letter that was written to Eastern Catholics that mandatory celibacy would be the general rule for priests. This is, by the way, very consistent with Pope Benedict's thinking. And I'm a big fan. Like, I love a lot of Joseph Ratzinger's works. Much of it's very good. But this is an issue here where he's convinced that it was universal and apostolic tradition. Pope Francis overturns this, okay, in 2014. He lifts the ban on the ordination of Eastern Catholic churches. This is important to note because there is this line in the Catholic apologetics world where, like, they say, you know, hey, you can be Orthodox and have everything in the Catholic world. But when they say these lines, they're very ignorant of Eastern Catholic to Vatican relations. They think that the whole, like, you know, centuries of relations is just wiped away with like a decade of a papacy. We need to see sort of like longer patterns, right? How about a century of consistent behavior by a pope? That would actually go a long way. But unfortunately, that's not what's the case. And so Pope Francis overturns Pope Benedict, and we don't know what's going to happen in future popes. This article also notes that an estimated 200,000 Eastern Catholics became Orthodox in the early 1900s because of them being persecuted by the Vatican. Now, today, this is a completely different situation. But Ben's article is going back to this other mode. Not entirely. He's saying let's tolerate Eastern Catholic priests, which is good to say tolerate. But tolerate's not good enough if we do have a whole tradition from St. Paul, preserved by Clement of Alexandria, but manifested at the Council of Nicaea and then maintained through Trullo. And by the way, the Council of Trullo states this in Canon 13, since we know it to be handed down as a rule of the Roman Church that those who are deemed worthy to be advanced to the diaconate or presbytery should promise no longer to cohabitate with their wives, we, the East, the Greek East, we preserving the ancient rule of apostolic perfection and order, will that the lawful marriages of men who are in holy orders be from this time forward firm, by no means dissolving their union with their wives, nor depriving them of their mutual intercourse at a convenient time. That means outside of fasting seasons and times. Wherefore, if anyone shall have been found worthy to be ordained a subdeacon or deacon or presbyter, he is by no means to be prohibited from admittance to such a rank, even if he shall live with a lawful wife, nor shall it be demanded of him at the time of his ordination that he promised to abstain from lawful intercourse with his wife, lest we should affect injuriously marriage constituted by God and blessed by his presence, as the gospel says. What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Marriage is honorable in the bed, undefiled. Art thou bound to a wife, seek not to be loosed. But we know as those who were assembled at Carthage with care for the honest life of clergy said that subdeacons who handle the holy mysteries and deacons and presbyters should abstain from their consorts according to their own course, so that what has been handed down to the apostles and preserved by ancient custom, we too likewise maintain, knowing that there is a time for all things, and especially for fasting and prayer. For it is a meat that they who assist the divine altar should be absolutely continent when they are handling holy things, in order that they may be able to obtain froth from God what they ask in sincerity. So we see Trullo giving sort of like a final decision. Yes, Carthage said these sorts of things. We also have the testimony of what was going on with the Council of Nicaea. And so Trullo is stating that these ways shall be the law, particularly for the Greek church.
So if this was an attempt to take the ruling of the local council of Carthage, which said priests who serve the Mass, priests who serve the liturgy, can't sleep with their wives anymore. What the Holy Fathers at the Ecumenical Council did was to take that and say, the effort there was to establish decency.
Now, the Latins did not accept all the canons of Trullo. It's kind of debated what canons they did accept. But all this to be said, it can at least be defended that the universal custom of the church wasn't just one way. There were diverse ways of preserving the holiness of the clergy. And that the Greek way, that was dominant in the East, also the majority of the church, maintained the rule that you can have relations with your wife even after your ordination as a presbyter and deacon. So I hope this little presentation was helpful for you. I'm sure there'll be more questions coming down the road, both from Orthodox Catholics, inquirers, about this question. But I do think a good case can be made from St. Paul and throughout the Orthodox tradition that this is a licit practice and really beautiful. I mean, this is why St. Olga, as a mother of 13, but also as a matushka, a wife of a priest, is so beautiful. And so we do not think that her life is detracted in any kind of way, but really the apostles allowed for this expression of the gospel in a family of a priest. All right, God bless. Have an amazing day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
The theme of the whole Bible is the divine indwelling of the world. That's why the Bible and Orthodox tradition are on exactly the same page. At the center of our faith is the transfiguration of human beings in the whole creation by the divine glory. The incarnation is thus nested in the center of Scripture. Scripture, the prophets talk about God coming in person. He's going to come. He's going to come more fully than he's ever come before. And then he steps into the world as this Galilean Jew, born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth. That's the most intimate relation that God can possibly appropriate to the world. And it happens in the person of Jesus. At the beginning of Ephesians, we read of the recapitulation of heaven and earth in the person of Jesus Christ. He unites all things in him. And then near the end of Ephesians, we read about male and female reconciled, harmonized, and put in right order through the work of Jesus Christ and through the imaging of the divine bridegroom in the life of the particular human bridegroom.
The whole New Testament can be called the gospel, since it contains nothing but the gospel teaching. The novice should first of all study the Lord's commandments in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And the study of the commandments in these evangelists combined with the actual practice of the commandments, the other scriptures that constitute the New Testament should also be easily understandable. This first episode is going to be free to all of you, and the rest will be for paid subscribers. Seraphim, thank you for preparing this Bible study through Ephesians.
Ephesians is one of Paul's later letters. It's relatively late in his apostolic career, probably somewhere in the early 60s AD. So this is, we might say, Paul's mature thought. And I think Paul, as he is entering into this decade, is aware that he's approaching the end of his apostolic career. This is something that you see in certain of his epistles, that Paul is aware that he's not going to live forever. He's aware that the main portion of his mission is coming to a conclusion, and then he thinks about putting his apostolic witness to writing as a kind of a perpetual testament and witness to his ministry. Zechariah 2 are the same as the words that are used in Ephesians chapter 3. This is Zechariah's vision of the cosmic sanctuary of the Messianic age, where God comes down and he dwells with man and he builds the city of God into his own dwelling place. And you can maybe start to see, if you're familiar with Ephesians, how this is emerging in Paul's mind in his elaboration of his vision of the church. Zechariah 3 and 6 actually explicitly tell us that these visions are prophetic of the Messianic age. It says, "Behold, this is the one who is a sign of my servant, the branch." The branch is Messiah, as you see in Jeremiah 23, where it's the branch of David, who's a king who's going to reign forever with justice and righteousness. And actually the branch in Zechariah is signified by the high priest, whose name is Joshua or Jesus. This is one of those texts where Jesus is kind of bursting out of the page and begging the reader to recognize him.